When the climate impacts are so clear, when the pressure is so strong, why is it that countries like Australia don't step up? Last episode, we looked at what Australia will be taking to COP26 in Glasgow and how inadequate it is, both in real terms and also relative to other countries, especially developed countries, much like Australia.
In this episode, we'll look at how we got to this situation. We'll ask the question, why are the governments refusing to react to clear messages, not only from the scientific community, but from the international community, and to clear and persistent pressure to commit to stronger targets and an end to fossil fuels.
Welcome to Good Cop, Bad Cop, where we explain what the go is with the big UN climate conference. Just recently, the head of the International Energy Agency, an influential body that sets out the modeling and the pathways for the global energy demand, threw up his hands in frustration and said, "I'm impatient, waiting for Australia to set out its net zero pathway." But the Australian government, rather than taking real action, prefers to use accounting tricks like it did in the past with the carryover credits from Kyoto, or currently by using land use changes rather than actual changes in fossil fuels and energy emissions to account for its climate action.
Why is it doing this? Why is the government trying to strike deals that will extend the life of fossil fuels when most of the world, including our trading partners, are giving up gas and coal? No matter which way you look at it, at face value, it just doesn't make any sense. Where it's obvious, we've been told we're setting ourselves up for economic and diplomatic failure, not to mention the catastrophic climate impacts we're contributing to. So to better understand what's going on here, we need to bring it back home for a minute and look at what's been happening in Australia since about 1990. And what I'm referring to is the influence of the fossil fuel industry on our politicians of both major parties, both in blocking climate action, but also in policies that prop up the gas and coal industry. And if we understand that domestic situation, then we understand Australia's behaviour internationally, including at Glasgow.
That's right, Polly, because basically Australia's international tactics, its lack of climate action globally, is really just a subset of what it does locally, which is to delay and push back and trick its way out of taking climate action. And if we look at just some of the key examples, the Australian government based its entire economic recovery from COVID-19 on producing more fossil gas for export, not even necessarily for domestic usage, given that's where most of our gas goes. The government stacked our climate agencies, like the Climate Change Authority, with fossil fuel interests. It changed the mandate and the remit of our clean energy agencies, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, to prop up and develop technologies that support the fossil fuel industry. Just recently, the Australian government decided that it would send a coal lobbyist as its ambassador to the OECD, another important international forum. And this is all on top of tens of billions of dollars in subsidies and tax breaks that we give in Australia to multinational fossil fuel companies.
So just to be clear, Australia's fossil fuel production in Australia is privately owned. It's not like the government is protecting state-based organisations here. And the influence of these companies is immense. And also it's kind of self-fulfilling. So the influence of petroleum, coal and gas sectors in Australia is twofold. So firstly, Australia is completely overrun by industry lobbyists and their lobby organisations representing oil, gas and infrastructure companies and their financial interests. And they're deeply interwoven into Australian politics. So there's at least a dozen active petroleum sector lobby groups in Australia, such as the Minerals Council of Australia, who I'm sure you're familiar with, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the New South Wales Minerals Council, the Business Council of Australia. And all of these organisations have undertaken a number of politicised campaigns on behalf of their members. Furthermore, the lines of these lobby groups and government are blurred because they're also in government themselves. So as Richie just alluded to, even from the PM's own office, two of his senior advisors have both held senior leadership positions within the Minerals Council of Australia.
And one of them is now being sent to the OECD as Australia's ambassador. Right when the OECD is deciding on whether it should ban financing of coal, Australia sends a coal lobbyist to the OECD as its representative. There's a joke here in the capital that there are more jobs in the coal and gas industry in Canberra than there are in the rest of the country, given how prevalent fossil fuel lobbyists are here and how small the size of the actual fossil fuel industry is when it comes to coal miners or those who work in the oil and gas sector, which make up less than 1% of the Australian workforce. It's a vicious circle in terms of the Australian government propping up the fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel industry then lobbying and feeding back into the Australian government. And that also comes down to cash, doesn't it, Polly?
It does. So, as you say, both these lobby groups and individual companies donate to both our major political parties, both the Coalition and Labor. And in Australia, the fossil fuel sector has been by far the largest financial contributor to both political parties over the last 20 years. So in 2020 alone, fossil fuel companies donated around $1.3 million to the ALP, Liberal and National parties.
And so if we look at the list of top donors, you've got Woodside, you've got the Minerals Council of Australia, and you've got Santos. And I guess it's no coincidence that the state and federal governments in Australia are still subsidising and still approving new coal and gas projects.
Yeah, it's no coincidence rather than reducing their production of fossil fuels, Australia's doubling down and actually increasing supply domestically and internationally.
And it's no coincidence that Prime Minister Scott Morrison says things like,
"Of course we'll keep on mining. We will keep mining."
In the face of a major report that found that Australia should keep 95% of its coal reserves underground if we want to meet the Paris Agreement goal of avoiding dangerous climate change and keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees.
It's also, funnily enough, no coincidence that we're coming to COP ready to talk our way out of more ambitious targets, to use sleight of hand to make it look like we're doing more than we are, and to broker partnerships that focus on low carbon LNG or clean hydrogen and seek carbon capture and storage that backs in the continued use of fossil fuels.
That's right. The Australian government will be spending more time trying to save face than actually save the climate. And it'll do this by brokering these technology agreements that just so happen to be technologies that support the fossil fuel industry to keep doing what they're doing. So to be clear, this explains much of Australia's domestic policy and, to some extent, Australia's international policy. And the fossil fuel lobby is active everywhere, and it's hindering global efforts everywhere, but I don't think more so than in Australia.
Yeah, you're right. It's everywhere. It's no longer a secret that these corporations have spent billions of dollars on advertising and public relations to improve their image and perversely present themselves as key actors that are able to design and deliver solutions to climate change. So every year, the world's 5 largest oil and gas companies spend around $200 million on lobbying designed to control, delay, or block binding climate-motivated policy.
I mean, just this month, an article was published in The Guardian in the UK that shows the government, the UK government, right, which is championing climate change and is the COP26 president, held private meetings with the fossil fuel industry, about 9 times as often as they met with companies involved in the clean energy production sector. And that's just in the last year.
And they're going to be doing it at the COP too. We've got this table here that shows that fossil fuel companies have been at the forefront of COP since its inception, both in terms of sponsorship, but also in terms of direct involvement in negotiations. So, for example, the International Emissions Trading Association sent more delegates to COP25 in Madrid than the entire European Union. AIDA is a lobby group for organisations, like Chevron, BP and Shell.
Yeah, no, I've met a number of their delegates there, given that they were so prolific and put on multiple side events. And sometimes they will often, if they're not represented by AIDA, they can potentially find their way onto a country delegation as well, especially the smaller countries that are more easily influenced.
Yeah, that's so parasitic. Yuck.
Um,
That's so uncool.
I mean, you can find yourself negotiating with Saudi Arabia, and then when you're having a coffee afterwards with them, find out that they actually work for Aramco, their national oil company.
So, just on that, Shell actually claimed to have helped write Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which basically is about carbon markets and encourages polluters to buy and sell their emissions via carbon markets rather than just reducing them point blank. They've been heard bragging about this.
And if you want to find out more about the real concern around carbon markets and the creation of offsets as a way of wiggling out of changing the way you produce things so they're not as emissions intensive, do check out a new report that Polly and I and the Australian Conservation Foundation wrote around some of Australia's carbon offset methodologies.
Oh, that's another whole episode.
Look, it's not impossible, though, to change this. At international conventions, you decide who can be in the room. The countries decide. And if it's clear enough that there are vested interests, then the parties can decide to keep those vested interests out. And a great example of this is the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Now, this treaty has contributed to significant and rapid progress in limiting tobacco and its influence in its global spread. The treaty recognizes that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry's interests and the public health policy interests. And so it goes on to recommend that there be almost no contact with the tobacco industry except when necessary to implement regulation of their products. Now, this doesn't exist in the UN Climate Convention. Despite it being tried, there are a number of countries that have blocked progress on limiting the influence of the fossil fuel industry on the UN Climate Convention. Can you guess who one of those countries would be, Polly?
Oh, tell me.
It just so happens to be the Australian government.
What?
And it will argue, it will say, no, we need to have them involved in the process. This is an open and transparent process, i.e., we want them to influence this process. They'll actually question the ability to define conflict of interest, which for some reason we've been able to define in many other conventions, including on this one on tobacco control. But look, there is a silver lining here. Glasgow City Council recently passed a resolution banning fossil fuel companies from using public venues during COP26. So the venues that are under the control of the city. Why? For the first time ever, we're seeing a government, especially a host government, actually take this issue seriously.
It shows that it can be done. We could ban fossil fuel interests from these negotiations. I think in Australia, we're led to believe that we are so reliant and that fossil fuels are so integral to the Australian way of life that the thought of giving them up in any sense is incomprehensible. Well, that's what we're told anyway.
Yeah, and part of that is because we've been told that for so long. But the Climate of the Nation, right, which is the longest running survey of Australian attitudes to climate change, found that people get the question wrong when it comes to the size of the core workforce. They get it wrong by a factor of 20. And when it comes to the size of the income that the Australian government makes, the tax revenue made from the coal industry, they get it wrong by a factor of 25. The same can be said for the gas industry, getting it wrong by a factor of 40 when it comes to the workforce and 45 when it comes to the income made. We don't need these companies as a major source of revenue or a major workforce, but we're told to think that we do. And that's the problem.
Yeah, so the point is really the influence of the fossil fuel sector is both significant in Australia and it's vast. It's all over the world. And it's increasingly sophisticated. Like pitching yourself as part of the climate solution is incredibly clever. And Australia is an excellent case study of a nation that's completely captured by coal, oil, and gas. There was an article out this month that put it beautifully. It said, fossil fuel companies have hijacked climate policy from the Australian people. And I would probably argue people all over the world.
So to understand why the Australian government is so poor on the international front when it comes to climate ambition, we explain why it is that the Australian government is so poor domestically, at home, when it comes to regulating fossil fuels and taking forward climate action. And it's because there's a vicious cycle of lobbying and money that circles about Canberra that keeps the rest of the country on this terrible pathway. And it's our job to break that circle, because gas and coal companies don't pay a lot of tax. They don't employ a lot of Australians. But what they do is they employ lots of lobbyists and spend lots of money on political donations. And it's the wrong way around. And if we want to see change, then we need to learn exactly how this all works so that we can figure out how it is that we can break it.
What I want you to remember is that we don't need fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry needs us. There is no place at the table for the fossil fuel industry at COP. There's no place at the table for the fossil fuel industry in Australia. And action on this starts with you. I mean, it's something as micro as sharing this video or starting a conversation with someone. Even better, lobby your local MP against this issue. If you don't feel you can do this yourself, then support the organisations that are acting on people's behalf to end the state capture of fossil fuels in Australia.
Join us next episode where we dig in deep to Australia's dirty laundry and show everything that Australia's been up to over the last decade or so of COPs.
Oh yeah, we've got a pretty checkered past. I can't wait either.